Hello everybody. So I've decided to do one video instead of two videos for your facial and brain blood vessels. Well, yeah. I may actually do just a second shorter video of your brain blood vessels if you guys want me to separate that out into a different video for those of you that just listen to these on repeat. But for the time being, because it's sort of short information, I have put it all into one area. This covers two sections of your lab list, two sections on the artery lab list, because you have the Circle of Willis, which is the last section, and that second paragraph, which are your facial arteries. And then you have the section of veins from the vein list that is the head and facial veins. So let's get into it. So first, we're going to look at the facial ones. We're not talking about the brain. We're just talking about what we need to know for our facial and major head arteries and veins. And the arteries on your lab list for this are the Basilar Artery, the Facial Artery, Lingual Artery, Superficial Temporal Artery, Maxillary Artery, Occipital Artery, and the Ophthalmic Artery. On the flip side of things, we have the list of veins that we need to go through. You have the Superior Sagittal Sinus, the Sigmoid Sinus, and the Transverse Sinus. These three veins weave in and out of the actual skull, so they are veins that actually impact the brain as well. And then we have the facial vein, the superficial temporal vein, occipital vein, and the ophthalmic vein. So you can tell that four of these, at least, right? So four of these are going to basically be the exact same thing, except one's the artery leading to that region, and the other is the vein leading to that region. Right? So let's get into this. So this is the picture that you guys have in your lab manual. It doesn't go into great detail about what these lovely arteries are branching here and there, but you can still tell what they are, right? And I'll show you a different picture next. We have learned that this is your brachycephalic trunk that branches into your common carotid artery and your subclavian artery, right? And we know that your vertebral artery branches off of that and heads straight on up to your brain. And we know that a little bit further up here, your common carotid artery splits into the internal carotid artery that continues up into your brain and stays on the inside of your skull. And your external carotid artery here branches off and starts branching into the arteries that feed your facial structures. This is where we are beginning. So everything that we are talking about for your actual face that is outside of the brain cavity and the inside of your skull is branching off of your external carotid artery. The main one you have labeled on this actual picture here is the superficial temporal artery. Superficial means it's close to the surface of your skin. If you guys remember from your skull anatomy in A&P1, temporal, this is your temporal bone where your ear canal is, and this is the temporal bone on your skull that starts to make up part of your zygomatic arch and your cheek, like the back end of your cheekbones. So you have an artery that branches off here of your external carotid and creeps all the way up to your temples, right? When you have studied too hard for this class and your head hurts and you are just rubbing your temples, you are rubbing your superficial temporal artery. We can tell here that there are a few other arteries that you need to know. You can't see your thyroid here because it's not on this picture, but this would be the beginnings of the superior thyroid artery creeping down to the thyroid here. You can tell that there is this one little artery that's not labeled here that kind of loops in, and you can tell it goes to the inside of the jaw where your tongue would be. That is the lingual artery that is on your lab list that you should know. And then you see this artery here that is creeping in to your jawbone here, right? This is your maxillary artery because it's creeping over between your jaws here to the maxilla bones, because if you remember, this is your mandible and this is your maxilla. Your top jaw is your maxilla. So you have this artery here that creeps around your jawbone to feed your maxilla here. That is your maxillary or maxilla artery. And you have this one artery here that is creeping up where it would be basically on your cheek and just creeping across your face. And this is your facial artery, right? So if we look at a different picture that's in different lab manuals, we can see that there are a lot more that are labeled. Remember, you do not need to know all of these. Don't freak out, right? But you already know a decent chunk of them. So once again, if we are going from common carotid here, we see the branch between the internal carotid and the external carotid. And off of that, we see, once again, because this head this time is tilted upwards and a little bit to the side so we can see inside the jaw, we can see the artery here that creeps in to feed the tongue is the lingual artery. This other one that is branching across the bottom jaw through our cheeks that's going up our face is the facial artery. This one here that is branching off, creeping behind the jaw and where the jaw meets the skull, to end up coming over here to feed your maxilla is the maxillary artery. And then creeping all the way up to the top of the skull, on the outside, we have the superficial temporal artery. Once again, the one you are probably rubbing right now. In addition to those arteries, we know that one of these internal arteries that branched off of the internal carotid, because you do not have to know many of these internal carotid branches. So one thing off of the internal carotid that branched here is this artery that is going to the eye sockets. If the artery is in the eye socket, it is the ophthalmic artery. Just remember ophthalmic, or when you go to an I'm not going to pronounce this doctor correctly, but ophthalmo means eye. So if you're going to an ophthalmotrician, or an ophthalmologist, those are your eye doctors. So this artery here that's going right here through the eye socket is the ophthalmic artery. Right? Which other ones did you need to know? Another one that is branching on the internal of everything is the basilar artery. You are probably not going to see the basilar artery on a sideways profile picture for any of the models or anything like that. We'll talk about the basilar artery in just a moment. But you do have this other branch off of the external carotid here that goes to the back of the head. And you remember that this bone here in the back of your skull is called the occipital bone. You have an artery that goes to it, and that is called the occipital artery. Right? And that should cover all of the arteries that you need to know minus basilar. So we've done facial, lingual, superficial temporal, maxillary, occipital, and ophthalmic. We are going to look here at the bottom of the brain. This is a good image of the Circle of Willis, and we are going to come back to this. But your basilar artery is one of the branches off of the Circle of Willis and part of what feeds it. So your basilar artery, bear in mind that in many of these, for all of these, you have a left and a right vertebral artery, remember? And you have a left and a right common carotid, a left and a right external carotid, and internal carotid. That means you have a left and a right maxillary and facial arteries because both of your cheeks need to get food. Both of your eyeballs need to get their blood supply, so you have a left and a right ophthalmic artery, all that kind of good stuff. The basilar artery is fed by both your left and your right vertebral arteries right here at their base, and where both of your vertebral arteries meet creates one slightly larger artery that runs the bottom length of your brain. And this artery that feeds into the Circle of Willis here that we'll get into in a minute is called the basilar artery. You only have one basilar artery. You don't have a left and a right one. You should only have one brain. but this is where the left and right vertebral arteries combine forces to form a slightly larger artery to help feed your brain, and that is the basilar artery. We will talk about that a little bit more when I actually talk about the Circle of Willis, but we're going to talk about the veins coming from your face and your brain right now. So if we have followed the blood to this point, right, and we know that our brain is being fed, now we have series of veins that will take the blood back to the heart. The vein that we have that runs along the top of our brains, between the two hemispheres, the left and the right hemisphere, is called the superior sagittal sinus. So that is a vein, right? And it is a singular large brain. Large vein, and it is the big vein that is running along the top of your brain, collecting used blood, right? That's basically snug between the nice two happy little happy hemispheres of your brain. So this is your superior sagittal sinus. If you remember your body terminology, regions, and that sort of thing, on your skull, where the two parietal bones meet, you have a sagittal suture there. This superior sagittal sinus is the vein that runs along the other side of that sagittal suture. So superior sagittal sinus, right? The two veins where your superior sagittal sinus ends up splitting back into left and right are called the transverse sinuses. These transverse sinuses split off of the superior sagittal sinus. So your superior sagittal sinus is bringing the blood down from the brain. It brings it in to the back of where the occipital bone is, and then splits going left and right. So from this point on, we are split, and we have left and right veins as well. And you have this transverse sinus, which is a vein. You have a left one and a right one that splits the blood to go to either the left side of the skull or the right side of the skull. So it's transverse, it's going side to side in the skull cavity. And then where it kind of zigzags up around some bone and comes back down along the sides, right, is called the sigmoid sinus. Wherever you see anything in your body make this weird curve shape, generally speaking, it is called sigmoid. This is why you also have a section of your colon or large intestines called the sigmoid colon, because there's part of your large intestines that's basically shaped like this but upside down. So your sigmoid sinus is connected to your transverse sinuses. It's where things make a little S shape, really, before everything gets dumped back into your internal jugular vein. Or in this case, from this picture, because of the way our little patient is facing, this would be the left internal jugular vein. Right? And you guys remember from our previous lessons that you have an internal jugular and an external jugular, and they will meet, and things will proceed back down to your heart. Right? So, larger picture of all of this, right? You can't see all of the veins, but this would be the occipital vein. I don't remember that one on y'all's lab list, but it may be. It is. Okay, so this is your occipital vein back here. You can't see the superior sagittal sinus, but you see the beginnings of the transverse sinus here, where it goes up and over to make room for your ear canals and other such things. This is the sigmoid sinus, and then that sigmoid sinus dumps back into your internal jugular here. And there you have it. Your internal jugular keeps going down. You have an external jugular. Everything is going to meet. And then you have a brachycephalic vein, which is where your jugulars and your subclavian veins meet. And then that dumps into your superior vena cava, going back down to your heart. You can also see the vertebral vein looping in and out of your vertebra. This is the picture that is in y'all's lab manual. I just pointed out some things that weren't labeled here. Also, a couple of other things that aren't labeled here. You can see the vein going into the eye socket here. You guessed it, that would be your ophthalmic vein. If you have something going in or out of the eye sockets, it's ophthalmic. So red lines would be ophthalmic artery, blue lines is your ophthalmic vein. You can see the facial vein right here, maxillary vein. There you go. And this picture does include your thyroid right here, so you can see the inferior thyroid vein and that one, your superior thyroid vein. So there you go. This picture is not in y'all's lab manual, but everything is labeled on it, so I've included it for you guys. You can see the ophthalmic vein, which is the vein that is through the eye sockets. Once again, superficial temporal vein runs next to the superficial temporal artery, so this is probably what you are rubbing right now. Facial vein is the vein that is creeping across the face and the cheeks. Occipital vein, veins in the back of the head. And then everything else just sort of falls back into place for all the other things that we have spoken about both in this video and your other videos. So that should be all of your facial arteries and veins. We've been over the basilar artery, facial artery, lingual artery, superficial temporal artery, maxillary artery, occipital artery, ophthalmic artery. And now we've been over your superior sagittal sinus, sigmoid sinus, transverse sinus, facial vein, superficial temporal vein, occipital vein, and ophthalmic veins. If that's all you wanted to study from this video, you can go ahead and pause it and stop here. The next thing we are going to go over, though, are the series of arteries that are in the brain called the Circle of Willis. So if you need, so if you need to pause this right here, go for it. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on with your Circle of Willis. Your basilar artery makes another appearance here because you need to know that it feeds into the Circle of Willis. There are 4 main arteries you need to know in the Circle of Willis. And you need to understand where the Circle of Willis is coming from and what it does. So your brain needs its own blood supply and it needs food, right? So the blood supply that is on the southern side of your brain, right, or the inferior side, coming up from your vertebral arteries here, your blood supply once again meets into the basilar artery, and your basilar artery ends up having all these nice little branches off of it that you don't need to know the names of. But it then hits that lovely middle pocket of your brain between the hemispheres where your pituitary gland is, and where other important nerves that you can see here crisscross. So your blood supply that's here needs to actually split and go around this. This isn't like a cave that you can tunnel through. You need to actually drive around the mountain at this point, right? So your arteries actually go from being nice and happy combined in the basilar artery to go like splitting left and right once again, where they stay split because half of them are going to end up feeding the left hemisphere of the brain and the other half are going to feed the right hemisphere of the brain. And there is a brief, happy moment where the blood could potentially come back together again. That is your Circle of Willis. Your Circle of Willis is the circle of arteries that basically detour from the basilar artery to go around the pituitary gland. And yes, this would be where the blood vessels in which your pituitary gland is dumping all of the pituitary hormones into so that it can hit your bloodstream and go to the rest of your body. And also, there is an additional feed into this Circle of Willis from your internal carotid arteries. So there's extra blood coming into this highway system that's from more than just your vertebral artery. because the goal of this junction on the inferior side or bottom side of your brain is to inevitably have enough blood in these arteries here to send up these side arteries that you can see in this image, like the middle cerebral artery, going to the middle parts of your brain so that your brain can be fed with a good supply of blood and sugar. So there you go. So your Circle of Willis, what you guys need to know. You have the basilar artery that goes into the bottom end of the Circle of Willis. And then you have these two small arteries that form a circle around the pituitary. There's a left and a right one. These are called your posterior communicating arteries, because remember, we are looking at the bottom side of the brain, the person's face or the front. This is as though they are lying on their back. So their face is up here. Head and face is pointing upwards. This is the back of their head back here. So these arteries at the beginning of the circle coming from the basilar artery are the posterior ones. So you have these two small arteries that are forming the circle here to create your posterior communicating arteries. So you have two posterior communicating arteries, right? And those posterior communicating arteries meet your internal carotid artery. And from there, the rest of the circle occurs. And the rest of the circle are these two branches that are going to end up branching into the left and the right hemispheres. They are called your anterior, because remember, this is the front of the face, the anterior cerebral arteries. So you have, from this middle junction here, you then have the anterior cerebral artery going to the left hemisphere and the anterior cerebral artery going to the right hemisphere. The circle is completed, though, because what I've just described is a line going up, two halves of the circle, and then an offshoot that goes beyond the circle up to the right and up to the left. The circle is completed by the anterior communicating artery. So your two anterior cerebral arteries are connected by the anterior communicating artery. So the circle that is going, the easiest way to remember this is the circle that is going around the pituitary gland is made of communicating arteries. You have two posterior communicating arteries and then an anterior communicating artery closing the circle at the top. The two big arteries on either side of your brain that feed your brain tissue are called the cerebral arteries, and you have two anterior ones. So you have an anterior cerebral artery on the left and the right, and coming off, like just branching off of the very beginnings of the posterior communicating arteries, you have two posterior cerebral arteries. So you have posterior cerebral arteries on the left and the right here to feed the back of your brain. So if you're looking at the Circle of Willis, the easiest way to remember it is the basilar artery is the singular one artery here going down the middle back brainstem. Communicating arteries form the circle around, so you have posterior communicating arteries and an anterior communicating artery. And then you have cerebral arteries, which are the branch-offs of it, and the ones you need to know for those are front and back, which in fancy medical terms are called your anterior and posterior cerebral arteries, and you have one for each hemisphere of the brain. So you have a right anterior cerebral artery and a left posterior cerebral artery, and you have a left anterior cerebral artery and a left posterior cerebral artery. So you got one of each, one on the right, one on the left. Let me know if you have any questions. And I hope this made things a little bit clearer for you, because a lot of these are not on any models we have in the classroom. Have a wonderful day.